Hello Year 4. So here's my copy of Bearkeeper. For those of you who are beady-eyed, you can see that it's quite different to Mrs. Cushing's copy. Mine's got an Elizabethan London on the front, so that might give you a little clue as to when our book is set. So Mrs. Cushing's read chapter 1, where a young Pip is in the woods fighting some imaginary opponents. So let's see what is in store for him now. Chapter 2. 6 days a week, Pip worked in the smithy with his mother's husband. Sunday was their day off. No one worked on the Sabbath. Every Sunday morning, the whole family walked to Mildmay, the nearest village half an hour away, and went to church. On Sunday afternoons, Pip was free. He could have picked blackberries, paddled in the stream, practiced writing his alphabet, or just fallen asleep in the long grass. Instead, he walked into the woods, found a quiet spot, and practiced fighting with his father's knife. He spent the whole afternoon there, conjuring up opponents, giving them swords and spears, knives and axes, shields and helmets. He was practicing for the fighting competition at Bartholomew Fair. One day he was going to win it, just like his dad did. That's what drove him onwards through that long, hot Sunday afternoon, ignoring the heat and his thirst and all the bits of his body begging him to stop. That's why he kept imagining new opponents for himself, clothing them and arming them, then watching them stroll out of the forest and take up their positions opposite him. One August, a few years from now, he was going to walk to London, find Bartholomew Fair, pay his penny, and enter the fighting competition. To win, he would have to defeat experienced swordsmen and battle-hardened soldiers. Against them, he would have only 3 weapons: his speed, his cunning, and his father's knife. Apart from the knife, Pip had nothing of his father's. He wasn't even sure that he can remember what his dad looked like. He had a few vague memories of George Stone's face and voice, although he couldn't help worrying that he'd invented them, stealing bits of other children's fathers for himself, borrowing the sound of a voice, the smell of wet cloth, the feeling of a hand on the top of his head. 7 years ago, Pip's father had walked out of the house and never returned. At first, Pip's mother, Isabel, had simply said that George Stone had gone away on business. He would be back next week, she promised. Next week had turned into next month, and then next year, but George never came back. He stayed away on business. What was his business? Where had he gone? No one seemed to know. A couple of years after George had left the house for the last time, Isabel knelt beside Pip. "I have to tell you some bad news," she said. "Something horrible has happened. Your father is dead." Pip stared at his mother. He didn't know what to say. He had a lot of questions, but didn't ask any of them, just kept quiet and listened as she explained that George Stone had been killed in a brawl, stabbed almost accidentally while defending a friend. Through his own strong sense of loyalty, George had been drawn into a pointless fight and murdered. "I want you to have this," said Isabel. She was holding a small knife in a leather scabbard. It was his. She pressed the knife into Pip's hands, and against the soft skin of his palm, he felt the 5-pointed star carved into the knife's wooden handle. A few weeks later, a man moved into the cottage. Pip knew him already. His name was Samuel, and he was the village smith. He shod horses, sharpened knives, and made scythes for the farmers. He was rumoured to be rich, a miser who had made lots of money but never spent anything. "This is your new father," said Isabel. Samuel smiled. "I think we're going to be good friends, Philip." Pip stared up at the smith, wrinkling his nose and saying nothing. He didn't want a new father. He wanted his own father back. Since then, George Stone's name had hardly ever been mentioned in the house. "You don't speak of the dead. You let them sleep in peace. That's what his mother said anyway. Pip felt differently. He quizzed villagers about his father, gathering facts and anecdotes, never quite sure which were true. George Stone was a soldier, said someone, fighting for Queen Elizabeth against the Spanish. George Stone owned a pet parrot, said someone else. George Stone sailed across the ocean to strange new islands in the New World and met black-skinned savages who'd never seen a white man before. George Stone captured Spanish galleons laden with tobacco and chocolate, silver and gold. When George Stone returned to Europe, he travelled to the Low Countries with the English army and fought alongside Sir Philip Sidney. During one of their battles, Sir Philip was shot in the thigh and died from loss of blood. That's why George Stone insisted on calling his own son Philip. Of all the stories, there was only one which Pip felt sure must be true. When George Stone left the army and got married, he didn't have enough money to buy somewhere to live, so he entered the fighting competition at Bartholomew Fair. Every August, thousands of people poured into London to celebrate the feast of St. Bartholomew. They took over Smithfield, an empty pasture on the northwestern edge of the city, just outside the walls. For most of the year, Smithfield was used as a cattle market, but for a week each summer, starting on St. Bartholomew's Day, the 24th of August, the enormous field was transformed into Bartholomew Fair. A riot of buying and selling, eating and drinking, performances and competitions. The most popular was the fighting competition. For an admission fee of 1 penny, anyone could enter, and the winner took home £10. £10 might not sound like much to you, but it was a lot of money in 1601. Most working men, butchers, bakers, farm labourers, would be lucky to earn that much in a whole year. That's why several hundred men travelled from as far as 50 miles away, carrying their weapons and queued up at dawn to pay their penny. A crowd gathered to watch. As the day progressed and only the better fighters were left in the competition, the crowd got bigger. Most years someone died. Many more lost a finger or an eye, and one was crowned champion. About 15 years before Pip had been told, George Stone came to Bartholomew Fair and entered the fighting competition, armed with nothing but a knife. The other fighters laughed at him. "A knife," they said. "A knife! What are you going to do with that? Cut up your lunch?" George Stone just smiled and said nothing. The other men showed him their weapons. One had a broadsword, almost as tall as himself. Another had a long-handled axe, big enough to chop down a tree with a single blow. A third had an Italian rapier, forged by Antonio Petruccio, one of the finest sword makers in Europe. George Stone never said a word, just smiled and kept hold of his knife, fingering the 5-pointed star carved into its wooden handle. The competitors were called forward, 2 by 2. The crowd cheered and whistled. The fighters stood opposite one another, staring into their opponent's eyes, checking for signs of strength and weakness. When the referee shouted, "Go!" they leapt forward and started fighting. By the end of the day, George Stone was covered in cuts and bruises. His nose was broken, his clothes were soaked with blood, and his own and other men's, but he had won £10, enough to buy a home for himself, his wife, and the baby growing inside her tummy. There we go. So, 15 years before Pip was born, his father, George Stone, good name, went to London to win the competition at Bartholomew Fair, 1601, set. So we've learned quite a lot about Pip and his family living in the smithy. Perhaps you could find out what a smithy is. In Mildmay, with his mother, Isabel, and his stepfather, Samuel. Bye for... I hope you enjoy the next chapter.